All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Welcome to 60 minutes of unscripted .NET entertainment. Our mission here is to empower the .NET community to achieve more. So my name is Luis, and I'm your host. And with me today are my co-hosts, David and Cecil.
Hey.
And today on the show, I'd like to welcome Tomas, who's joining us here to talk about .vvm. So Tomas, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, thanks for having me. My name is Tomas Herceg. I'm from the Czech Republic, and I'm Microsoft MVP for a couple of years. And I'm also a founder of an open source framework called DotVVM, which helps .NET developers to build web apps using the Model-View-ViewModel pattern.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that introduction, Tomas. But before we get started talking about .vvm, I think David's going to walk us through some related bits. So let's do that.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I'm going to add my screen here. So the related bits section that we're going to share today in honor of .vvm, since VVM is based on the MVVM pattern, we wanted to share the MVVM toolkit. So it's a community-based toolkit that's available on NuGet. And you might be asking yourself, what is MVVM? Luis, could you share the link on the bottom, the banner? So this toolkit has a bunch of primitives that you can use. And it shows you how to install it using like the package manager and what using statements you'd have. But a lot of these primitives are for kind of leveraging the toolkit, and I think it's pretty neat. And .vvm itself is a little bit different in that it's based on web, and this is cross-platform, so it's .NET standard. So they call out specifically like UWP and WinForms and WPF and Xamarin and Uno and things of that nature. But you might be asking yourself, what does MVVM stand for? So this wouldn't be like an official episode of anything technology related if we didn't share chat GPT real quick. So this morning I was like, well, how would you summarize the MVVM pattern and why a developer might consider using it? So this is the response from chat GPT. I'll share it later in a tweet after the show, but yeah, that's kind of it for our related bits section. Hopefully you're intrigued by the pattern and you're willing to check it out. And let's just get into the meat of it with the hallway track and really jump into it.
Let's do that.
Chat GPT, gotta love it. Awesome. So
Tomas,
yeah.
Would you like to first of all confirm or deny whether ChatGPT was right, and maybe you can help enlighten us here as to what MVVM and .vvm specifically is?
Yeah, so of course that was the first question I asked ChatGPT. What is .vvm and why every .NET developer should use it? And I posted it on my Twitter because the answer was quite. I was really amazed. I was really thrilled because I'm talking about .vvm quite often, and the ChatGPT could explain it even better than I am always explaining that. So I started to be worried about what we will do in few years because these tools will get better and better. So maybe we are already screwed as humankind. We will see.
That's amazing. So wait, to be clear for our viewers here, you're the creator of .vvm, and you're saying that this AI explains it better than you do.
Sort of. Part of that is, of course, because I'm not an English native speaker. It's not my native language.
Sure.
So
That's fair.
the English used in ChatGPT, I think it's much better than what I'm typically producing. But okay. But anyway, so of course, if anyone from the audience is interested in knowing what exactly .vvm is, just ask ChatGPT. But if I should explain what it is, it's an open source project. I started in 2014, so it's quite old, but it's evolving since that time. And today I'm not the main contributor of .vvm. There are more people from the community who are contributing to this package more than me. And basically, it's a web framework for ASP.NET Core, and also it supports the old ASP.NET, so it can be also interesting for people who are still using .NET Framework. And as we already mentioned, there is the MVVM pattern. And the idea is quite similar to what Blazor offers today, because with Blazor you can write web apps with using just C# and HTML, and .vvm can do the same thing. So it's very convenient, and the learning curve is very friendly, because you don't need to learn JavaScript and all the related tools and technologies. On the other hand, you are still on the web, so if you know JavaScript, you know TypeScript, you know how to use these technologies, you can build much better applications, much better user experience, even with .vvm. But the point is that you don't have to learn that. And it's an open source project. We have extensions for Visual Studio, which we are also building. Recently, we have published a new version of VS Code extension. So even if you are using Linux or Mac, you can have the syntax highlighting and basic IntelliSense for your .vvm apps. And current version of the framework is 4.0, and in few days we will be releasing 4.1. It should be before Christmas, as a Christmas gift for our community. So it should be nice. And I think that the most interesting things is why would you use this framework? So I see, or we in our team, we see two main use cases. First, if you like MVVM, and you know it from WPF or Xamarin or any other technology, you will find .vvm to be very convenient, to very familiar with the concept, so you can just start building the apps in a similar way you are used to. And also, because .vvm still supports even the old ASP.NET, it can be a migration bridge from ASP.NET, for example, ASP.NET Web Forms to .NET 6, .NET 7, because you can install the .vvm NuGet package in these old projects and start using the framework, and maybe slowly getting rid of the old web form stuff. So once you get rid of all web forms pages, well, you can just upgrade the project to .NET 7. It doesn't support the classic ASP, as there was a question in the chat. So sorry, classic ASP is not supported, but ASP.NET Web Forms, very old technology on .NET Framework, it's supported. And how it works, so basically every page in .vvm has two files. First is HTML, which is using classic HTML syntax with few syntax flavors. We will see them in a demo. And the view model is a C# class. So basically you will declare properties to represent the state of the page, and also the methods which can be called from the page. And the .vvm package itself contains the built-in components, for example, grid view, file upload, repeater. So there is similar to other Microsoft frameworks, there is a bunch of standard components which ships with the framework, so you can just start using them. And these controls are pure HTML things, so you can easily style it with CSS to match all the design guidelines you are used to. So,
really quickly before you dive in, I saw earlier in a slide that you mentioned C#, and in this one as well, it calls out C#. But we have a question from Fuel here. Does it work with F# and VB?
Sort of, because the most of the community is, of course, using C#, so that's what we are focusing on. The framework itself will work with VB.NET and with F#, but the tooling, like Visual Studio Extension, it will not work very well in non-C# projects because some things are in VB, some names are case insensitive, which can make a lot of interesting issues to our extension. But of course, if there's anyone in the community who is using VB.NET or F# and want to help us, we would be really, really happy, because none of us are using these languages quite often, so we don't even have any. We don't have much time to even test how .VVM works on these languages.
Makes sense. Thanks.
So maybe I should apologize that I'm sometimes saying C# on places where I should say just .NET, but it's just because we are focusing on mainly on C# because that's the most popular choice for most .NET developers. So in this slide, and I will show the demo very quickly. So here it's .vvm syntax is just HTML. There are some components. You can see this prefix, which basically maps the control to a namespace from which it's coming. And here there are some data binding expressions. So this is a two-way data binding to the view model. So whenever this value in the view model changes, this control will reflect the value, so it will appear in the text box. And if the user changes this number, it will appear automatically in the view model. So it's two-way data binding. And if the user clicks on the button, this C# method will be called. And we have a lot of nice syntax flavors here. So there is a variable called _parent, which can get you to a parent binding context and things like that. So it's a bit easier than in WPF, where you had to use some relative source or things like that.
So I'm curious, when just looking at those two examples, if you go back real quick. So I see the HTML and I understand the basic syntax for the binding, and I see the model on the right. How are these two things actually, aware of each other? Like where's the glue?
The glue is what's not in the slide. Every HTML file starts with something like @ViewModel, and then there is the name of the type, which is mapped on this specific view model. But you don't have to write it because it will be auto-generated by the Visual Studio extension for you. So I almost never edit that line. It's just there.
And so this is another question right away. It's a bit of a selfish question, but I wanted to know, and I saw that my friend Peter Morris is in here, so he might be curious as well. Why would someone want to choose this over like Blazor, for example?
I think that the biggest thing for me is the MVVM approach, because when I'm working on some customer projects and projects for my customers in my company, we are building a lot of line of business applications where users are inputting a lot of data. So typically our forms are very complicated, hundreds of fields, a lot of dependencies between each fields, and a lot of dynamic sections in the forms, like user clicks buttons and rows in the forms are appearing and things like that. And the view model, the MVVM approach, is for me preferable way to represent this, because you have all the state of this complicated form in one object. You can use this object, you can test it, and make sure that if you change a value in one field, then the other fields will reflect that change and that the form will update itself. So for me, it's a preferred way. Maybe it's just a thing of personal preferences. Of course, you can write the same app with any other approach, any other technology, but I feel that I'm quite productive in these scenarios with MVVM.
So quick question about that then, and maybe I missed this. Like, where does it run exactly? Is this like a server-side running thing, or does it run on WASM in the browser? Because if you compare it to JavaScript, I'm going to assume that you're talking about the browser, right?
I will show a demo, and basically it's running both on the server and in JavaScript. We are not having WASM on the client yet. We are working on an option to be able to run C# on the client, but this C# you see on this slide is running on the server. And the framework generates basically HTML and pieces of JavaScript, which will make this experience. They will basically take the view model and transfer it to the client. And on the client, it lives as a JavaScript object until you call some method where the C# view model is resurrected. So just very quickly, if you want to try .vvm, just go in Visual Studio to the extension manager, search for .vvm and install the extension, and then you can click File, New Project, and that's it. So I have a demo, and it's a very simple page. I will show it first, just 2 text boxes and a button, so I can write 10 plus 15 and be able to calculate the result. And now what is the magic behind that? So if you look at this markup, you can see there is syntax highlighting and things like that thanks to the .vvm extension. And basically, here are 2 text boxes bound to some integer properties on the view model. And there is a calculate method which will just calculate the result and assign it to another view model property. So this is just mutating the view model. And if you open this page in the browser and look in the DevTools, you will see that here in this element section, we have something like this, input type text. So .vvm translates the controls to pure HTML, similar as in other technologies. And we are using a JavaScript library called Knockout.js, which is this data bind attribute. It just makes the MVVM experience on the client. So .vvm will basically create the instance of the view model on the server and then render the page. And this view model is serialized in JSON and sent within the HTML. It's if you look down, the view model is serialized here with some cross-site request for jury things and some additional metadata. And so the view model very shortly lives on the server in C#. Then it moves to the client where the page can interact with that. You can even write your own JavaScript that will touch and work with this view model. And thanks to the data binding, a lot of things are happening on the client. So when I write 15 here, the JavaScript object will get updated immediately. And
interesting. So I noticed one thing real quick that I wanted to ask about specifically. So these are text inputs. So what if in here we just put like ABC and hit calculate? What happens?
There it will produce a validation error. And on this app, I haven't set up validation framework, so it will not do anything. I will just see some weird error message. But in the next demo, I will show how the validation works, and you are basically using the model validation for that, using the validation attributes.
And then we do have lots more questions starting to stream in now because people are starting to kind of connect all the dots, and they're like, wait a second, what is this thing that you're showing? So Peter Morris specifically is asking, what benefit does MVVM give him over having the same code in a .cs file behind?
I'm not sure I understand this question. Maybe, I see. I see. In many technologies like WPF or Xamarin, you can choose if you want to use the MVVM experience or just if you want to interact with controls from the code behind file. So you can say textbox1.text equals something. And in .vvm, you don't have this choice because this framework is a bit opinionated. So the MVVM approach is the only way. And for me, the main advantage is that this view model is testable. So I can create instance in the unit test, set some properties, call methods, and make sure that these methods are doing the things they are supposed to be doing. And you can use dependency injection here, so you can inject your services, use mocks and things like that. Yeah, so that's for me, it's about testability, it's about maintainability. You can also, it's a nice division between the front-end people and back-end people, because the front-end people, if they decide that text box is not a good way to edit numbers and they will change it for some other component, I don't have to touch the view model at all. In the view model, it's still integer. Yeah. So no matter if the front-end people will choose any other component that can edit numbers, they are free to do it, and they cannot break anything from the view model and underneath. Yeah. So this separation of concerns is also very useful on a larger project as well. And to continue, when you click this button, it's calling a C# method, but I said that now the view model is living on the server. So what actually happens when you click the button? The view model will get serialized in JSON again. The .vvm client-side library will send it to the server, and on the server, the server-side part of .vvm will invoke this method. And if the method changes something in the view model, the changes will be sent back to the page, and the view model on the JavaScript will get updated, so the controls on this place, the number 15 appears. If you look in the DevTools on the Network tab, and I can refresh the page once more. So if I do this and call the method, you will see that the payload is the view model, so it gets sent to the server, and I'm receiving just the view model difference. So it tells me, okay, just this property changed the value to 25. So the only limitation for the developers is that the view models has to be JSON serializable, so .vvm can transfer them back and forth. And this is not the only way how to call server methods. .vvm offers another ways. One of them is, for example, if this expression is simple, .vvm can translate these expressions to JavaScript. So this will not call the server at all. It will just transform this code snippet to JavaScript. We are not using WASM for that, so this is just some kind of transformation which will just take the code and generate the JavaScript representation, but it's for manipulation of the things in the view model. We support most of the things, like manipulating with the collections. We support some pieces of link, so even if you want to filter out some items from some collection, you are free to do it, and it's not calling the server.
So one thing I found interesting, you mentioned there's an extension, and I'm assuming that's what's giving you not only your syntax highlighting here, but I noticed that if you zoom in on these files, these are actually called .html and .master. So those are different.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the way we had to choose some extensions, so we could tell Visual Studio, okay, use this kind of syntax highlighting for this .vvm file. So that's why we have our own extension for that. We are just using the HTML editor, which is part of the Visual Studio, but we are extending it with support of these expressions and these directives. And there is also like IntelliSense, so you can, it's quite convenient if even things like F12 to go to definition, it works. So awesome. It's quite convenient.
Interesting. So Joe K is actually asking if they can use their own JSON serializer. Is that like a configuration option or an overload, or how does that work?
Yeah, right now .vvm is using Newtons of JSON because we also support the old .NET framework. We are thinking about migration, but the benefits for most of the users are not that big. There is some performance improvement, but we are not sure how much important is this for most of the users, so we didn't do this change yet. But you can use just the JSON converter attribute on any property, and .vvm will use this kind of serialization. I would say that you need to know what you exactly want to achieve, because .vvm assumes that if it's integer on the C# side, it will be number on the JavaScript side. So if you like break this condition, you will have to also extend .vvm on the client side in JavaScript, so these things would work. But it's definitely it's possible. You can extend the JavaScript translation framework we have as a part of .vvm. So if you do this, you can add support for your own types. Recently, we have been adding support for dictionary, for example, and that's using these concepts. So we have custom serialization of dictionary, and we have implemented translations for methods on dictionary. So you can call this from the JavaScript. Another thing I can show, and this is my favorite, is when you want to build applications, line of business applications that are interacting with database, because I believe it's a very common scenario for a lot of people. So DotVVM contains several components for that. One of them is grid view, and basically you can define your own columns. We have several types of columns, template column. If you have been using web forms or things like that, you will see this is pretty similar to that, or also in WPF, the grids are defined in a similar way. What we are doing here is .vvm is using, you can bind just a list of items to the grid view, or we have a special type called grid view dataset, and basically it's a list wrapped with information about paging and sorting. So this list is carrying also the metadata about which page of records you are looking at, how is this collection sorted, something like that. And we have a simple extension method like load from queryable, where you are just giving iQueryable to this grid view dataset, and it will apply the paging and sorting automatically. So it's just loading data from database is just give it iQueryable, and I'm not doing any kind of sorting and paging in the iQueryable. Sorry, this is how the query looks like. So I just give it all orders from my database, even if there are a million records, and .vvm, the grid view dataset, will apply the paging and sorting functions automatically. So it's very easy to use. And of course, if you are not using Entity Framework or iQueryable, you are free to load data whichever you want. This orders object has the items collection, which is just the list. So you can read the paging and sorting things and make your own SQL query or use anything you want. So it's quite easy, and the grid view then supports like sorting, paging automatically. I didn't have to do anything, just give it iQueryable and it's doing its job. So another thing we have here, some rows are highlighted with this ugly color. Sorry for that, because I'm not a front-end person, so my visual artistic, I will be much better than me in this. And so the grid view can, for example, specify a row decorator, and you can basically append any kind of CSS class based on some conditions. So for example, this is adding CSS class VIP order to rows where the total price is greater than 500. And if you want to combine multiple CSS classes, you can say just class active equals some other expression. For example, everything will be active, and this will like build that crazy expression that will concatenate all the classes where the condition evaluates to true. So you don't need to use these ternary operators for building a chain of CSS classes. You can use this nice declarative syntax for providing that. That's also one of my favorite features. There was also a mention of a validation. So we have an extensible validation mechanism. For example, this contact email property in the view model, it's using the standard data annotations attributes or required email address. You can also use the resources here for the localization of these things. And .vvm is able to render some user interface based on that. So one of the options is, for example, apply CSS class on some element if this property is not valid. So for example, if this contact email is not valid, this is saying that this CSS class will be applied on this div element, because I don't want to apply it directly on the text box. I want it on the div up there. And for the application, you can manage the CSS class that will be applied. So this can be set, for example, on the entire form, and it will propagate to all the controls inside, or you can specify it globally for the entire application. So it's very easy to make a unified experience for validation. So you just mark where the rule should be applied, and then you set the rule which will actually be applied. And it's extensible, so you can implement your own behaviors. There is also the validator control and validation summary and all those standard controls you are used to from other frameworks.
And to make sure that I understand correctly, the validation is happening server side, and these sort of attributes or these, what you're adding here is just so that the front end sort of lets the user know, hey, before you send this, there are errors with the view model.
Most of the validation rules are also doing on the client. So if the required field is, for example, if the required condition is broken, there will be no communication with the server. DotVVM will generate the validation on the client. If you write your own validation attribute, then, and in all cases, it will be done on the server, because if the user will build their own HTTP request, of course, we cannot validate just on the client. So if DotVVM can translate that, it will be validated both on the server and on the client. And of course, every single time, it's also validated on the server. You also can see I'm using this iValidatable object interface here. So also DotVVM will call this validate method, which will, for example, check that there is at least one item in the order object. So otherwise I will get an exception or the validation error. Yeah. So you can also build your own validation logic.
Wouldn't that hypothetically throw an exception if order items was null?
But if the user is playing with the page just using the UI, there is no way how they can set it to null, because it's in the view model, it's initialized by default. When the view model is created, I'm initializing this collection, and the user doesn't have any way how to put null there. If they will play in the browser DevTools and set null to that, of course, my code will crash here. On the other hand, if they were playing with the JavaScript and the DevTools, they kind of deserve HTTP 500.
Interesting. We do have some other questions coming in. So Jose is asking, .VVM seems to be recommended when there are a lot of screen interactions. So when would you recommend using MVC over .VVM?
I like MVC when the application is just presenting a lot of data, maybe a lot of complicated structured data. But if it doesn't gather much complicated user input, then MVC would be maybe easier, because you don't need things like two-way data binding if you are just showing the data. So if 90% of the application is just presenting data, then I would use MVC or something maybe even simpler than MVC. But on the other hand, if the goal of the application is to let the user input a lot of structured data, then I think the MVVM, I would choose it. But you can also combine these approaches because .VVM is just a middleware in the ASP.NET Core pipeline. In the startup file, I'm just calling like use.vvm, but I can also say use MVC in the same app. So for example, if I would build an e-commerce site, maybe I would choose MVC for the public facing part and do the admin, the back office part I would do in .vvm. And you can perfectly combine these things in one app, because if .vvm doesn't find in the route table, if it doesn't find any matching route, it will just pass the request to the next middleware. So like you can combine these things with SignalR, with Blazor, with anything you want. It's just a middleware in the pipeline.
So that's actually really good to know, because there was a question earlier that I think we had scrolled past that was, could this be hosted with like Blazor server, and can those live side by side? And it seems like, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
The only different difficulty would be that if these are not completely separate parts of the app, you would probably need to make like 2 master pages, because I'm using master page here, so this is the template for the entire layout of the page. And if you want to combine like Blazor and .vvm, you will have to do this thing twice. But you can use the same CSS, so the users may not even notice that there are 2 pages, look the same, but they are built in different technologies. But of course, it's a nice thing that you can just build 1-2 pages in .vvm just to try, and you will see if you like this experience.
And quick question on conventions. So I noticed that the view models and the views, do the names of those files have to match up, kind of like with code behind?
They don't have to match up, and the binding is defined here. So here is the view model directive, and here is this full type name, including the assembly name. So the view model can be even in a different assembly. But a lot of users are not using this convention. They are just doing something else, like they keep the page and the view model together. So even on some of our projects in my company, people are using different convention when they have the pages folder, and every page has its own folder where you can find the page, the view model, and also some page-specific CSS files, page-specific scripts, even page-specific images, so things like that. And .vvm doesn't force you to use this convention. This is the default convention, but if you place the files anywhere else, no problem. These files can also be as an embedded resources in some DLL. So if you want to, for example, ship a NuGet package with a part of admin UI for the functionality in the NuGet package, you can, because the loader of this file is extensible. It's just one interface, so you can implement your own if you want, or use the embedded resource loader we already have in the framework.
That's interesting. I really like that. A lot of people aren't super familiar with embedded resources, and I've been a big proponent of those for a long time, so that's fascinating. I did want to ask a question here. On line 1, where you say @ViewModel, I see that you've got the namespace and then the view model, and then there's a comma. So after the comma, what is that convention? What's after the comma?
That's the assembly name. So this project is named differently, but in the CSproj, in the property groups, I have the order management app. I believe this is optional. Visual Studio will just generate it for you, but if it would be in a different assembly, you can specify the assembly name here. It's the standard format. If you use the system type and call toString on that, it will produce this information in this format.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
So, and we are using type.getType to parse this back.
Got it. So the other thing is, you just said that Visual Studio would do this for us. So that leads me to believe there's like a templating or like scaffolding engine.
Exactly. If you say add new item, and here if you see ASP.NET Core, you have this template for page, master page, user control, view model. We also support, I think, JavaScript modules. It's great if you want to integrate a third-party component in .vvm applications. I can show a simple demo where I'm hosting React control in .vvm page. So there are templates for that, and there is also file new project experience, which will generate the project for you. So we have also other things for localization, like extract to resources, so you can highlight some piece of text and just have it extracted to a resource file. It's great when you are localizing your application.
That should exist in Visual Studio proper. That's amazing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Also, there is extract user control. If you are reusing pieces of markup, you can see extract .vvm control, and it will create a separate file with a piece of markup.
In the generation here, a few folks asked, are source generators involved at all in that process?
No, source generators are not used so far. We have a lot of things in our backlog that would be nice to do with sort generators, but this is pretty recent feature, and this framework started in 2014. So a lot of things we have handled differently. So for example, when you open this page in the browser, .vvm is generating some code in the background, so the page would be fast. So the first load of the page is a bit slower, the others are pretty fast, but we are building our own expressions, link expressions, and then compile them to a method. So
sadly, that is true. There's ways to get around that with type providers, but yeah, unfortunately, source generators are not an option with F# and VB.
Yeah, that's another reason. And I'm not sure how well it works in .NET Framework projects, because still we are targeting also .NET Framework 4.7.2.
Yeah, there's more people. I'm scrolling back a little bit. There's some other questions here, like SwiftCut's asking another question. Why would you use this over like a SPA, like a single page application, like with React, for example?
Basically, just one thing, you can also use SPA in .vvm, because if you change this content placeholder, which is the place where the concrete page will be placed, so if you change it to SPA content placeholder, it will make you a SPA. But if I would be using React, I think that the biggest issue for me is that I would have to know JavaScript really well to use React, which is not a problem. Like, it's one of the things you should do. And the other thing is that I would have to build some kind of API on the server and call this API from JavaScript. And I can use Open API or something like that to generate my API clients and things like that. Or I can maybe use GraphQL or gRPC. There's plenty of options, but also it involves quite a lot of work to do. You have to create the API, you have to have something to call it. So, and it's some code you have to write or maybe generate, but the code doesn't do anything interesting. It's just taking data from one side and pulling them to the other side. And in .vvm, I can just not do that, because I just write a function on the server and I have the results on the client already. So I even don't need GraphQL, because the view model it already contains all the data the page needs, and it gets serialized and sent to the client in one request. Yeah. I'm not saying that APIs are bad. If your application already has API for mobile clients and for other things, you can also then making React frontend might be better. It depends maybe on your frontend team. If they are familiar with React, they will be maybe more productive. If this is maybe for people whose primary expertise is .NET and they are doing frontend, like me, I cannot make the application look nice. Maybe AI will help with that soon. But I'm able to make a frontend, and if I use Bootstrap, it won't look so ugly. Yeah, this comment is true. I'm also with .vvm, it's very similar, because I also don't need API. Another thing, if you have REST API, .vvm can call it directly from these bindings. We have a thing called REST API bindings, so you can call REST API directly from here, so you can load data in grid view. It has some restrictions, you cannot do everything with that, but it's also a use case we have been playing with in the past.
So, earlier in the show, talking high level about MVVM as a pattern, a lot of people were alluding to the maintainability and testability and how it makes certain things easier. So how would you, agree or disagree with that? And do you have any code examples of tests for how you might kind of exercise and validate some of the stuff that you've written?
I don't have any sample here in this project, which I have loaded, so that's a good catch. I should add a demo for that. But on the other hand, it's quite simple, because here is if I would want to test, for example, this page with the grid, I would just create instance of this default view model. It's using one service I would want either to use in my integration test, because this is using database, this service. So either I will make it an integration test, so I will use a real instance over some test DB, or I can mock this service because I'm trying, even in demos, I'm trying to separate the business logic to this service. So I don't have any data access code here. I'm just calling this service, please give me iQueryable. So it's quite easy to mock the service, and then you can just make sure that this orders collection will get loaded. For me, the bigger value is to test against a real SQL database, because this is adding some order by and skip take expressions. So I want to make sure that it will not generate some kind of order by which cannot be translated to actual SQL. But of course, you can mock this out. So the unit test or integration test for this would be quite simple. Just new default view model. You will put the service and call some methods or look at these properties.
Okay. Well, and what about like the binding mechanisms and the various different states of validation when the model looks one way versus the other, and how the HTML might render and apply CSS? Is that something that you would recommend testing? And if so, how would you do that?
Okay. There are two things. If you want to test validation states, there is the view model has a context property, and there is something like model state. I don't know why my validation, why my IntelliSense is not working here, but there is a model state collection, so you can look if the validation errors look like they're supposed to do. All validation errors will get to this context model state object. And if you want to make sure what the framework actually renders, we have a package called .vvm.testing, and it contains some infrastructure for integration testing with the... I'm thinking I will be able, hopefully, to show it on GitHub in our repo. There is basically there is a method called something like run page. So you will just this control test helper. You can put it some piece of markup and call a run page, and it will process the entire request without actually calling the HTTP stack. So if this is what you want to do, you can load the entire .html file here and put it some instance of the view model and look in. This will return you the instance, how the view model looks like. You can even call the commands on that, so you can click on buttons without having the browser, without invoking the user interface. It will just emulate the communication between that. So if this is the level you want to test, you can, but I think that we are using this mainly for testing the individual controls in the framework. I have never tried to use this for entire pages. It would probably work, but I think that we are, in such case, I would prefer to using like Selenium or Playwright or something that would actually run the browser and click on buttons, because also you want to test the JavaScript part of the framework, where you want to really make sure that if user clicks on something, it will work.
Awesome. Cool. We did have one other question here, and it kind of goes back to like the rendering engine itself. So how is it that you're actually rendering the HTML on the server? Like what are you using?
We have our own HTML writer, which contains several optimizations, so it's reasonably fast for us. It could be even faster if we would be using spans or some kind of light performance magic from the recent versions of .NET, but again, it would not work on the old .NET. So until we support the old .NET, we are a bit conservative about these new features. Sometimes we have like dual compilation that using this hash if expressions. We have some implementation for old .NET, some for the new .NET, but we don't have we don't want to have a lot of places like that.
And the other part of that question rather was, does it happen with every request, or like how do you dissect like, just partials or deltas, and what's that look like?
Right now, it's the HTML is rendered for every request. However, the pages are pre-compiled, so basically the request just needs to build a few objects that represent the element in the page, and then it just calls render, so it will go through the entire tree. We have been playing with some caching, like if the part of markup is really static and there is nothing that could change in that, then we would want it to pre-cache things like that, but I believe we haven't finished this feature yet. And for most users, if they found some performance issues, they were mostly on the client side, because if you load 1000 rows in the grid view, the problem is typically not on the server because it's pretty fast, but then the browser will try to instantiate all these elements in the DOM, and that's what's taking most of the time. So we have also been playing with some virtualization and things like that. And we have done several performance optimizations over the Knockout.js, which it's a great library. It's kind of old, but for the 8 years we are using that, we haven't found any bug in this library. And we just built some infrastructure on top of that. So we are not using all of the features, but some of them, and it's a very nice library still.
So I was just browsing through the .vvm.com website, and I noticed that you have some parts of the framework are open source, but you also have some paid options as well. It looks like the paid options are mainly around additional controls. So I think what would be interesting for folks is if we could kind of like understand like what part of this is open source, and like what are the parts that I can get like additional support and additional controls for.
Yeah, so basically the framework is open source, it's free, it's on GitHub. VS Code extension is open source and it's on GitHub. And the Visual Studio extension has a free version, which has the syntax highlighting, basic IntelliSense, and things like that. So anyone, including students, schools, non-profit organizations, can use .vvm for free. And we are also doing a free support on our Gitter chat and other Stack Overflow. We are watching the questions about .vvm and we are responding there. If someone likes .vvm and wants to use it on bigger projects, then the commercial add-ons can help mainly to be more productive. We have better components, which have more features. They have some like built-in CSS styles, so you don't have to build your own CSS. You can use some defaults look and feel of the components we have in our, for example, .vvm business pack. And also there is a paid version of the .vvm extension for Visual Studio, which gives you better IntelliSense. For example, this F12 experience, it's not in the free version, it's in the paid version. So the idea is, if you want to use .vvm for something serious, it's better to pay because you have more features, you are more productive. And it helps our framework to be sustainable. So we still have a backlog full of features. We are here for 8 years and we still think that this makes sense. We like this framework and we want to add new features. So we have found this model and it's working. So it has been working so far.
Yeah, and then the pricing also looks very reasonable to me, right? Like we've seen tons of like other vendors and components things, and we know how pricey they could get sometimes. And then looking at this, like for instance, like your base model, I think this has like bootstrap components. I believe it's it's $69, right? Which again, like I've seen things like that for like a lot more. So for me, I'd love to encourage folks that try out the framework, try out the open source stuff. If you like it and you want to try out some of those other components and a bit better support and intelligence sense and stuff like that, like I definitely want to recommend folks considering like making the investment and like trying out some of those paid for options as well.
And the last thing I would like to show, if you are missing any control in .vvm, you can use React components, because basically what this thing here, JS bar chart, it's a React component which is using some React charting library, and basically you can pass some parts of the view model to the control, so it doesn't have to call its own REST API or things like that. You can just say this thing from the view model will be passed to the control, and you can respond to things in the component. So for example, if I click on some series in the chart, it will call this command and I can update my view model based on that. And the magic here is I'm just building my bar chart wrapper, which will get the properties from the markup file, and I'm using a recharts library to like render this chart. And then I will just use some plumbing which will like expose this bar chart wrapper as a bar chart control in the page. And if I show this, it's just showing this chart. I don't need to call REST API because I have my data already in the view model. So if I click on this, it will just change data in some like weather data collection in the view model, and the component will get a notification that you have new data here, some of your properties has changed, so React will just re-render this thing. And when I click on some series, it will update some other property in the view model. So this is basically two-way communication between .vvm and React, and we are also building wrappers for Svelte and in the future probably for Vue.js. So if you don't find any of the components in our .vvm ecosystem, you can easily take any third-party React control and integrate it here. For this, you need to know at least bits of JavaScript. I'm using TypeScript here, and we have ESBuild configured here, but it's not that difficult, and we have samples for that, so you can just copy-paste it from our sample and make it work in your project.
Cool. I don't see any questions that have come in. So if there's any, we probably might have time for one more question here. But if not, maybe we can start wrapping up here. Unless Tomas, you have anything else you'd like to share with folks?
I have just a few links. If you go to our main website, .vvm.com, there is instructions where you can find the extensions. So I encourage, if you like MVVM, just to try this Visual Studio extension for VS Code or for Big Visual Studio. And we also have a documentation. We are doing our best to keep it updated. So if you find any problems or anything that is missing in the docs, please give us feedback, because we would be happy to extend the documentation so it would really work. And we have also several sample applications on our GitHub repo, so you can navigate for that. And we also, I missed this link here, but we also have a Gitter chat. It's linked from our GitHub repo. So if you want to ask the .vvm team anything, you can just write on the chat, and all the team is watching the conversation, so we will be happy to talk.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I see a lot of folks here in the chat just thanking you for the session. I think it was really great. And thank you to folks that tuned in and asked all these really great questions. I forgot to mention that this is the last show of the year. So after today, we are wrapped up, and we're going to be back next year. I believe the second week, December 9th, something like that. Oh, sorry, January 9th. If you are interested, there's a link here, AKMS On-Net Live Guest. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, if you have anything cool that you'd like to share, anything you're working on, anything you learned, we'd love to, host you and have you on. If you are celebrating any holidays over the next few weeks, happy holidays. And just make sure to tune in on January 9th. We are going to, I think I saw a comment earlier that said F# gets no love. Well, F# is going to get some love on January 9th, where we're going to have Owner joining us to talk about F# and some really cool things that he's doing with it. So make sure to tune in January 9th. Again, happy holidays, and we'll see you in a few weeks. Take care, everyone.
Bye, friends.
Thanks.